Look at this carefully. In the middle of the North Atlantic, a single oil tanker is being hunted. Above it, US military aircraft circle the sky. Nearby, a Coast Guard cutter waits. And beneath the surface, Russia has sent a submarine. This is not about oil shortages. It is not even just about sanctions. This is about who has the authority to stop a ship and who has the power to prevent that from happening. A tanker accused of carrying sanctioned oil changes its name, changes its flag, claims the protection of the Russian state. The United States prepares to board it. Russia moves to shield it. Pause here, because when warships and submarines begin escorting commercial vessels in international waters, something fundamental has shifted. If you want to understand how global order is quietly being tested and rewritten, stay with me. Share this analysis if you believe these moments shape the future more than headlines do. Because to grasp what's unfolding now, we must first understand why this ship matters at all. What makes this tanker so important is not its cargo. In fact, it may be empty, but what it represents. At the center of this story is a long-running effort by the United States to enforce sanctions on oil exports from countries like Iran and Venezuela. These sanctions are designed to choke off revenue, to deny regimes the cash that sustains power. Over time, a shadow system has emerged to bypass them. Tankers change ownership on paper. They sail under false flags. They turn off tracking systems. And when scrutiny intensifies, they adapt. This vessel did exactly that. It changed its name. It switched its registry. And crucially, it claimed the protection of the Russian state. Under international law, a ship is an extension of the country whose flag it flies. That single detail transforms a commercial enforcement action into a geopolitical confrontation. What once looked like a routine seizure now risks becoming a standoff between nuclear-armed powers. And to understand how we arrived at this moment, we need to step back into the history of sanctions, shipping, and the slow evolution of this maritime cat-and-mouse game. To understand this moment, we have to look at how sanctions and shipping evolved together over time. For decades, oil sanctions have followed a predictable cycle. First, restrictions are imposed to isolate a government, in this case Venezuela, and oil allegedly linked to Iran. Then enforcement tightens. And finally, markets adapt. Tankers became the pressure point. Oil cannot move without them. As sanctions expanded, a parallel maritime ecosystem formed. Vessels shifted ownership through opaque networks. Flags were changed, names repainted. AIS tracking was manipulated or turned off. These were not accidents, they were survival strategies. But enforcement adapted too. The United States stopped focusing on what a ship looked like. Instead, it tracked what could not be disguised: the vessel's underlying identity, its ownership networks, and its sanctions history. That is why reflagging alone does not erase risk, and why attempts to seize ships like this one have increased. What is different now is the response. This time, a sanctioned tanker did not just evade detection, it triggered a direct show of state power. And that shift leads us to the first real crisis point in this story. The first crisis came when enforcement moved from tracking to action. Last month, US authorities attempted to board this tanker in the Caribbean. They had a warrant. They believed the ship was heading toward Venezuela. And under US sanctions law, they were prepared to seize it. Then something unusual happened. Before boarding could take place, the vessel abruptly changed course. It did not slow down. It did not negotiate. It turned away dramatically and began moving toward Europe. Almost immediately, the sky above the North Atlantic grew crowded. US military transport aircraft appeared. Refueling tankers followed. Reconnaissance planes linked to special operations were tracked in the same corridor. At sea, footage later released showed a ship matching the profile of a US Coast Guard cutter shadowing the tanker. And then came the escalation. Russia confirmed it had dispatched naval vessels, including a submarine, to escort the ship. This was no longer a sanctions operation. It was a signal: if this moment feels like a line being crossed, you're not wrong. Share this analysis if you think these quiet escalations deserve more attention. Because behind this confrontation lies a deeper mechanism, one that explains why this ship became untouchable. What lies beneath this standoff is not improvisation. It is a system precise, legalistic, and quietly weaponized. Sanctions enforcement no longer revolves around flags or paint. It revolves around identity. Every ship carries an IMO number, a permanent marker that follows it through every name change, every registry shift, every ownership transfer. That is what US authorities track. But international maritime law adds another layer. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, a vessel sailing under a recognized national flag is in effect under that nation's protection. Boarding it without consent is no longer a technical enforcement action. It becomes a political act. By reflagging to Russia mid-voyage, this tanker altered the legal terrain. It did not erase its history, but it raised the cost of enforcement. Now, any attempt to board the ship risks confrontation not with a crew, but with a state. And not just any state. Russia's message is subtle but clear. Sanctions may be enforced through systems, but power still determines where those systems stop. This is how rules are tested. Not in speeches, but in moments when someone dares you to act. And that dare sets the stage for the next escalation. The second crisis unfolded not with a single dramatic move, but with sustained pressure. As the tanker moved north, US officials confirmed that boarding was still being considered. Washington made it clear it preferred seizure over destruction. The message was deliberate. This was about enforcement, not provocation. At the same time, Russia issued its own signal. Moscow stated that the vessel was sailing in international waters under the Russian flag and in full compliance with maritime law. It described the attention from US and NATO forces as clearly disproportionate. This was escalation by language and posture. Not missiles, not gunfire, but proximity, aircraft shadowing, ships tracking, a submarine beneath the surface. Every move narrowed the margin for error. In moments like this, accidents matter more than intentions. A misread radar signal, a misunderstood maneuver, a decision made in seconds that diplomats cannot undo. This is how crises between major powers now emerge, not with declarations of war, but with overlapping missions and incompatible rules. And while governments trade statements and signals, there is another group absorbing the consequences quietly. The people connected to this system. Now let's shift the lens away from governments and toward you, because sanctions, naval escorts, and legal arguments do not exist in isolation. They ripple outward, and eventually they land in ordinary lives. If you depend on stable energy prices, this matters. If your country imports fuel, this matters. If inflation already feels relentless, this matters. Every time enforcement tightens and supply routes become riskier, uncertainty enters the market. Insurers raise premiums, shipping costs climb, companies hesitate, and those costs don't stay at sea, they move inland. You feel them at the pump, in electricity bills, in the price of food transported thousands of miles by fuel-powered systems. And beyond economics, there is anxiety. Because when you see submarines escorting tankers in international waters, you sense that the rules keeping global trade predictable are under strain. That order is no longer guaranteed. It must be defended. If this feels distant, it isn't. These confrontations shape the stability you rely on every day. Stay with me. Share this if you believe people deserve to understand how power games at sea reach their own lives. Because what happens next doesn't stop with one ship. It spreads outward across regions, alliances, and the global balance itself. What we are witnessing here is not a local dispute. It is a global signal. When a sanctioned tanker is escorted across the Atlantic by a nuclear power, every government is watching, allies, rivals, and countries sitting uncomfortably in between. For the United States, this is a test of credibility. Sanctions only work if they can be enforced. If one vessel slips through under military protection, others will follow. And the message to sanctioned states is clear. Endurance, not compliance, may be the winning strategy. For Russia, the calculation is different. Escorting this ship projects reach. It shows that Moscow can complicate U.S. enforcement far from its own shores without firing a shot. It also positions Russia as a protector not just of ships, but of alternative economic networks. And for smaller states, the implications are sobering. If great powers begin selectively shielding commerce from global rules, the space for neutral trade shrinks. Pressure to choose sides grows. This is how fragmentation accelerates, not through grand announcements, but through precedents that quietly reshape behavior. And once precedents are set, the future stops being abstract. It becomes a set of paths, each with its own risks. From here, the future splits into three distinct paths. The first is restraint. In this scenario, the tanker completes its journey without confrontation. The United States signals resolve, but steps back from boarding. Russia avoids further escalation. The system bends, but does not break. Sanctions enforcement becomes more cautious, more selective, and more political. Order survives, but weakened. The second path is normalization of defiance. More sanctioned vessels reflag, more escorts appear, enforcement becomes uneven. Sanctions still exist on paper, but their real-world impact erodes. Power, not law, increasingly determines outcomes. The global economy adjusts fragmented, less efficient, and more volatile. The third path is the most dangerous. An incident, a miscalculation, a boarding attempt that goes wrong. In this future, a single ship becomes a trigger, not for war, but for escalation that no one planned and no one fully controls. Trust collapses, military presence becomes routine, crisis becomes the baseline. History tells us that systems rarely collapse in one dramatic moment. They fray, they stretch, and then, suddenly, they fail. Which path emerges will depend less on declarations and more on what leaders do in moments like this. And that brings us to the final question. This story forces us to confront, look again at that tanker in the North Atlantic, not as a ship, but as a signal. It tells us that the global order is no longer enforced only by rules and institutions, but increasingly by presence and power. That sanctions, once thought of as technical tools, now sit on the front line of geopolitical competition. This standoff did not begin with a crisis. It emerged from adaptation, from a system designed to apply pressure and another designed to learn how to absorb it. The question is not whether this ship will be seized. It is whether the precedent it sets will spread. If power continues to override enforcement, global trade becomes less predictable, more guarded, more militarized. And everyday stability, the kind you rarely think about, becomes fragile. Understanding moments like this matters, because they rarely announce themselves as turning points until long after they pass. If you want to keep making sense of a world that is quietly being reshaped, stay with me, share this analysis, and join me in the next video where we look at the next fault line before it becomes a crisis. Because the most important shifts in global order often happen far from the spotlight at sea, in silence, and just out of view.